So as you may have seen in some of my previous videos, I've gone over some data mining and leaks for the potential Season 4 theme that we may be getting. The specific information pertaining to what I want to go over in this video being the leaked information around the Season 4 theme being based on the Iron Wolf faction. And one of the most interesting parts of this leaked information is an elixir that was both data mined and found on the PTR. And this elixir has some very interesting effects that I think has the potential to be applied to more elements of Diablo 4. Now, the elixir I'm talking about is the Profaned Mind Cage, which is a rare elixir. It lasts for 60 seconds and it increases helltide monster levels by 10 and increases the cinder drop rate and threat gain. So basically this elixir juices up helltides for 60 minutes for you specifically. Now, some information we don't know is if this elixir stacks, it would actually be much more interesting and much more crazy if you could just build up a bunch of these elixirs and stack them up a bunch, massively increasing the level of helltide monsters and just massively increasing the cinder drop rate and threat gain, which is basically buffing up all of the most important parts of the overhauled helltides. Now, this elixir itself is very interesting. It's going to be even more interesting if it stacks, but this effect could be applied to many other systems in Diablo 4 to make them much more interesting. Now, because this is focused on an open world system, we can start some other open world systems because pretty much all of the open world content of Diablo 4 gets very easy as you get into the end game. This is something that's been, I think, a negative of Diablo 4 for pretty much its entire lifespan, that most of the content in Diablo 4, once you get to say max level, is just generally really easy, especially the open world. The open world stuff by like level 80 is usually pretty easy, but with the overhauled helltides that are already much more difficult than they used to be, and with this elixir that could possibly be stacked, helltides can now be something that's more difficult into the end game, and with that increased difficulty, you obviously get the increased rewards that are part of this elixir. So imagine having an elixir like this that buffs up world bosses. So now maybe you pop an elixir or you pop a bunch of elixirs that stack up the difficulty and you go do a world boss. Now this world boss could be a much higher level but give a lot more loot, or maybe even give much higher tiers of loot, or maybe you want to go farm a bunch of open world whispers to farm up a bunch of gold. Maybe there's now an elixir that when doing objectives for whispers, all of those enemies are going to be much more difficult, but maybe this elixir gives you double the caches when turning in your whispers. And then you even have something like the Legion events that have always been pretty good for leveling and also are more rewarding because they also give boss summoning materials now. Maybe you have an elixir that massively buffs up those, makes enemies much more difficult but gives you a lot more loot, and you could even have different versions of elixirs like this. Maybe you could have elixirs that you can get early on while leveling that makes stuff more difficult but gives you a bump in experience. Maybe this will allow you to stay in more open world settings while leveling up and getting into the end game. And if you have a stronger build, you could pop an elixir or maybe stack up those elixirs to get even more experience to level up quicker. This would also massively help with alts because alts can generally be much stronger, especially with the codex overhaul. So maybe when you get on an alt, you'd be able to stack up more of these elixirs to just level up more quickly. But again, this isn't just giving more loot or giving more experience. This would be you buff up the difficulty for a limited amount of time, but you get pretty heavily increased rewards for doing that. So there is a bit of risk and reward because even if you could still kill the enemies after using these elixirs to buff them, maybe you're much less efficient. So maybe this doesn't even give you more rewards because you're much less efficient killing enemies and progressing. So there is that risk and reward, but these being part of elixirs gives you a lot more control in juicing up different content in the game. Now, converting this specific elixir into more instance content actually makes a lot less sense because you have, say, nightmare dungeons that you can just increase their difficulty through the sigil system. They wouldn't really need to add an elixir to do that even more. We will now have the pit in season 4 that already has hundreds of levels, so you wouldn't need an elixir to increase that difficulty even more. And then you also have all the endgame bosses that are now going to have level 200 uber versions of them, so you don't really need elixirs to buff them up up more either. But this is where expanding on this idea of these elixirs that buff things up could actually be expanded into much more interesting territory, because this Profaned Mind Cage elixir just buffs up the monster level and then gives you more cinder drops and threat levels. Let's say they give you a bunch of different options of elixirs that buff up content. Maybe one elixir you have pertains to the endgame boss ladder. Let's say you're just doing Duriel runs. Maybe there's an elixir that like doubles Duriel's health, but gives you like a 50% chance to get another unique item drop. That would probably be worth it for any endgame characters farming Duriel, but you would need to get that elixir, and you would probably need a build that had enough damage to actually make that work. Or let's say you can get an elixir for Nightmare Dungeons that makes all of the enemies deal double damage in that Nightmare Dungeon, or even all Nightmare Dungeon you're doing while the elixir lasts. But let's say the glyph experience you get for completing that Nightmare Dungeon is also doubled. So again, giving you pretty good control on basically juicing up the content you're doing, but the elixirs always have risk and reward, because let's say you're doing a level 100 Nightmare Dungeon and you pop the elixir that makes all the enemies deal double damage. If you can get through that dungeon, the amount of glyph experience you're about to get is pretty crazy. But let's say you're not tanky enough, you go in that dungeon and you just get one shot a bunch of times and you fail the dungeon. Well, now you just failed that dungeon, you lost a level 100 sigil, which is a good amount of dust. You lost a good amount of time off your elixir that may have cost a good amount of resources. So there is that risk and reward. There's the upside and the downside. And I think those elements are something that's really good for an ARPG like this. And I do also think that, as mentioned, having these elements tied into this timed elixir that gives you some pretty good control over what you're trying to buff could also be very interesting. It also allows you to make elixirs much more relevant even once you get up to level 100, and makes all of the resources around these elixirs much more relevant. You could even do things to balance out specific elixirs for doing specific content even more. Let's say you had that theoretical elixir for Duriel where he has double health, but you have a 50% chance to get another unique drop. That elixir itself, maybe you would need a certain amount of Duriel mats to actually make that elixir. And let's say that elixir also lasts 60 minutes. So maybe you would want to craft one of those, build up a bunch of Duriel mats, and then go try to face Duriel for 60 minutes with a super endgame build, but now you're just going to be getting a ton more unique items. And one of the reasons I actually want to do this video is because this is an actual data mined item. Someone found this item on the PTR as well. So this is an item that's not only like theoretical or data mined in a file somewhere that might never be used. This was actually in the PTR. So this is something that we will be getting at some point. But more importantly, we know this system actually works. The ability to pop an elixir and retroactively buff up the difficulty of monsters in helltides specifically, so a specific piece of content, and give you more drops specifically from the enemies in that area. Because I'm sure there are a lot of games out there that can't actually get something like this to work, or it just take a lot of time to get something like this to work. This retroactive buffing of both drops and difficulty. And because this elixir can work, basically all of those other theoretical elixirs I talked about in this video could also potentially work. And again, would just give you a bunch of control to make things more difficult, but also giving you control on what additional rewards you want from that increased difficulty. So I'm pretty interested to see how the Profaned Mind Cage ends up playing out. And I also think that there's a lot of room for a similar system like this to be expanded to most other pieces of content in Diablo 4. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.